Scripture says in Proverbs 29:18, for lack of vision, people perish. And I'm going to argue that the same could happen for our marriage. For lack of vision in our marriage relationship, why would it not flounder and even perish? Because we don't know where we're going relationally. And so I think that's super important. In the 14 years that I've been working with couples in various capacities, I can count on two hands those that ever say that they've developed a vision for their marriage. And so I do want to normalize things, that you guys are not an odd duck. If you've not developed a vision, if you've not considered that, a lot of us will think about that more for our family versus our marriage. And I think the reason it's important to think more about the marriage and include the family is that the marriage is going to, it's going to keep going after the kids move on. So the marriage vision has to work for you and be sustainable for as long as God calls you two together, until he calls, one of you home. And so that's important. And so I want to just look at, why is it important to have a vision? One of the reasons is that it anchors your marriage and it helps you know where you're going relationally, not logistically. I do want to differentiate between relational interaction and logistical interaction. And so I'm really going to use more language, and I want you to consider relationally, not logistically, because as a couple, you can logistically be firing well. Like, how to make things happen, check things off the list. If you have kids, get kids to where they need to be. But relationally, you're very disconnected. And so really think about this more from a relational aspect, not a logistical aspect. What brings connection? What brings you together? What helps you be like-minded in those different important values and things that you want to accomplish relationally? The next thing I think it does is help bring stability to the relationship. It's just that consistency and stability that I think all of us want. It doesn't mean if you're adventurous or excited or you like change, but I'm talking about consistent and stable relationally, again, and how the vision for your marriage can bring that together and that be a strong foundation. And then, when you're making decisions for life, for your marriage, for, connecting, what does it look like to invest in our relationship? In those decisions, does that fit and align with where we want to go relationally? Does that fit with our vision for who we want to be as a couple? And so I think, those are some foundational things that are very important on why it's important to develop a vision for your marriage. Next, I would say is just, here are two areas to think about when you're looking at creating a vision. One would be for you guys as a couple, and then the next would be this idea of, who do you want to be as a spouse? And so I'll differentiate those here. As a couple, like, what again connects us, what unites us, how are we on the same page, how are we again like-minded, and where we want to go. Like, why do some couples want to live in a city and others want to live rural? I mean, there's no right or wrong. It's just, it speaks into the different values or desire you have of how you see doing your relationship. And this, whether we're conscious of it or not, what you do speaks into who you are. We just want to flip that and focus more on the idea of who you want to be, and then decide what you want to do to accomplish who you want to be. And I'll unpack that a little bit more. So as a couple vision, it can include your family, but it should not center around your family. And in my argument, because again, I shared earlier, your kids will grow up and go do their own life and develop their own vision for who they want to be if God calls them or when he calls them to be married. And some of those things they'll adopt that they grew up in, and others they'll want to do differently. One of the things that I have found when it comes, though, to the individual spouse is this idea of like your calling. Like, who do you want to be? Like, for me, who do I want to be when I show up as a husband in my relationship with Amy? And that cannot be dependent on what Amy does or doesn't do. Amy can speak into that, but ultimately, It's by God's word, who do I want to be as a husband? Because there are principles of what he calls us husbands to be when we show up in that role. And then, what do I want to do based upon the unique design that he's given me in my wiring and how I see life and what I want to accomplish. And what I've found often that I think is unfortunate, but it makes sense, is we often let our spouse determine who we are going to be and what we're going to do based upon, things like, oops, I'm in trouble. I just got the look, so I need to change who I am and what I need to do right now to accommodate or make, my spouse happy, which, man, that's not really a calling or a vision, because you're letting someone else determine your calling and how you show up and interact. And so, a calling as a spouse and sort of tying that to vision, I would say like 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient. The part in 1 Corinthians 13, love is patient, love is kind, is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrong, it is not rude, it's not proud, it's not self-seeking, it always trusts, hopes, endures, and perseveres, love never fails. Like that is a calling of who I can be when I show up in my husband role. Or I can look at things in scripture that say, husbands are to love your wives and to, lay your life down as Christ did for your spouse. And what does that look like then? Who do I want to be when I flesh that out in my relationship, with Amy? And then Amy's going to have her unique, calling in her wife role. And so that's all going to blend together in our vision and bringing clarity, for that intentionality. Because this is what I've found in the years, doing this, that what brings you into marriage cannot sustain you in it. That's not a vision, and that's not intentionality. Because eventually what brought you into marriage, that's going to wear out. It's not sustainable. And so what do we do to consistently engage and be intentional to create an environment and a healthy vision for our relationship? And so whether you would, create that prior to entering into marriage, or you do that in the first year of marriage, or maybe you guys have been married for years and this is a new concept, never thought about this, or we've tried that before and it just hasn't worked, or, we've done that, we just need to re-engage in it and sort of revisit that. And how do we consistently engage in our vision of who we want to be? And so, one of the things I want to talk about here is really the mindset of the thinking of how we enter into developing a vision or creating a vision for our relationship. And so right now, you might have a story going on that could be based in guilt, shame, and condemnation because, we should have done this earlier. We haven't been able to stick it out if we've tried. Either you're beating yourself up or your story is beating your spouse up because, I've advocated for this and they haven't wanted to do it. Or it could be a story you're telling yourself of excitement. Man, this sounds like a neat opportunity. I'm excited to see how this could bring a more solid foundation to our relationship to stand on and bringing more purpose to who we can be as a couple, and then go out and do the things, again, that accomplish who we want to be. So what I'm saying is there's a belief going on, and that belief will lead to a consequence or an action that you do or do not take based upon what you're thinking right now. And so, what I really want us to look at is there is an opportunity moving forward to develop a vision statement, regardless of all the shoulda, woulda, couldas of the past. In looking through the front windshield of our relationship car, we do have an opportunity to start developing a vision statement or to re-engage in that or to, build that foundation moving forward and the benefits and blessing that can have for our marriage. I also want us to think about a couple of things when we're thinking about and the mindset we have is sometimes we're ready to develop a vision statement. We just don't have the tools or the framework with which to do that. Or other times we have that framework, but the attitude of the heart hinders us from being able to pursue a vision statement because there are things that are, internal hindrances. Again, I go back to that thinking. Sometimes pride can be an internal hindrance, or that can be an attitude of the heart or fear, or whatever that maybe negative story is, that you're telling yourself, or just the story that maybe, well, marriage should just work out because I think great marriage doesn't mean it's going to happen. I mean, that would be a great idea, but it's also a lazy way of trying to make a good marriage succeed. And so, in that, I think it's important to have the right mindset, perspective moving forward. And sometimes there's a lot of maybe struggles going on in the relationship. So it's hard to maybe think about how would we develop a vision statement. And in sometimes working in the intensives with couples, we do need to get through some issues and challenges and speed bumps so that we can get to a vision statement. So, there are proper sort of processes or maybe ways to engage in it, that if there's a lot of struggles and maybe relational dysfunction right now, the important thing is more to get some of that resolved, because typically developing a vision statement would be more for we're somewhat healthy or we're in a more healthy place relationally in order to engage in developing that vision statement. So those are just some thoughts or ideas. And at the end of this, if those are some challenges and there are struggles there, I will share some things that we at XO can help maybe in that process so you can get to developing a vision for your relationship. So now I want to talk about sort of the focus. When you think about developing a vision statement, what do you want to focus on? So most of us couples or individuals think more about what we want to do or more about goals or objectives. And that's not wrong. I just think maybe that's not in the best order when you first start to develop. And so I'm going to say, really focus on who do you want to be as a couple. And who you want to be is more based upon, values. What's that overarching vision for our relationship? How does that unfold? And then you would focus on what are we going to do to stay focused on, again, who we want to be. And so this is an example in my wife and I's marriage. And so if you hear me say the word Amy in the future, just remember that's my wife. And so in bringing that in, this is what it looked like for us. And really, she grew up more in a family system that advocated more for vision, developing that. I did not per se, or that wasn't maybe brought my way as far as coaching in a way of looking at developing visions and et cetera. What I will say is a lot of us will develop maybe a personal vision and mission for ourselves that really is focused more on who we want to be individually, but sometimes that leaves our spouse in the dust because they're not really a part of that process. So again, I don't think about, work or hobbies or that, but really focus on your marriage and relationship. And so our overarching vision that we worked on in our first year of marriage, and we had several brainstorming sessions. This was not something that we necessarily had a template for, but we had enough maybe wherewithal to understand how that needed to unfold. And so, we would just ask each other like, hey, what's your idea of a great marriage? What comes to mind either biblically or practically that you see as important, in a marriage and in a vision. And so we have sort of an overarching vision that it says to glorify God and enjoy him forever. And then to be disciples and make disciples. And so then we would ask the question, okay, what does it look like in our relationship to glorify God and enjoy him? And then what does that look like to be disciples and make disciples? And so really, again, we're focusing on who we want to be as a couple. We want to be a couple that looks at it more through the lens of marriage discipleship. Because remember, marriage is a journey. It's not from event to event to event. Marriage is a process. It's a journey that includes events along the way. And those events, how we navigate them will expose or show just what our vision is. Do we have one? Or man, we're floundering because it's like when I show up in my role as husband, I don't know what my purpose is or where I'm going with you relationally. And so, in that, it's harder and harder to engage if we don't have that sense of purpose of where we're going relationally. And so we would just ask those questions like, okay, Amy, what do you see as glorifying God and enjoying Him forever in our marriage? Because her way of seeing that is going to look different than mine, right? It's not like she's right and I'm wrong, or vice versa. I'm right and she's wrong in the way that she thinks about glorifying God and enjoying Him forever, or what discipleship looks like. And so I'm going to advocate for whatever you guys bring to the table, that when you hear those things, this is good communication. On a side note, it's to value what your spouse says and brings to the table. But remember, you want to do it in a forward-thinking way, not in a rear-view mirror way of what we should have done or what you should have done. Because again, we can't change what's happened up till now, but we can do it different moving forward. And so, man, Amy, I love the way that you think about glorifying God and enjoying Him forever. And that's a really neat perspective. And I really appreciate, how you're seeing that. And, this is how I'm seeing it. And then we say, okay, the way you're seeing it, the way I'm seeing it, no one trumps the other. How do we then bring that together? And now we have a sort of a we definition or understanding or idea of how to glorify God and enjoy Him forever, and to be disciples and make disciples. So that's just sort of our overarching tagline. And then we would go into what are values or character traits that we see as important to developing our vision statement for who we want to be. And so we have things like, we want to be a marriage of peace. We want to be a marriage of trust. We want to be a marriage of adventure. We want to be, a marriage of missional living or stewardship. So those are sort of core values or character traits that we bring to our relationship. But here's again where I'm going to say there's a process to this. So when I say the word stewardship, my guess is that Amy will have a different definition and understanding of stewardship than I do. So then, we ask each other, hey, what's your definition, or how would you define stewardship? And then we both get to share that, but then the goal is again to make a we definition for stewardship. Again, this is real life and adventure. My idea of adventure could probably be a bit more conservative, possibly, than Amy's idea of adventure, where she sees that more maybe broadly, that's more maybe exciting, where I could be like, adventure is camping. And that's about as far as my adventure goes, where her adventure is like, well, my adventure is skydiving, or, it's traveling the world, and that's adventure to me. And so obviously we're operating from maybe different lenses based upon, again, that more adventurous spirit versus maybe conservative spirit in that word. And so we each get to share what adventure looks like to us. Then we make a we definition. And then we start to say, okay, what can we do, based on resources, time, season of life we're in, to just get some of what we see as a core value of adventure in our relationship. Or what does it look like to develop peace in our relationship? And what's your idea of a peaceful relationship? Because my idea of peace could be like just chill, relax, where hers is go, 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 and you can have peace in the midst of doing a lot in life. And so again, it just looks different. And so we want to honor each other in that discussion and conversation. And then once we get a we definition, we say, okay, what can we do to accomplish a peaceful home? What can we do to accomplish a trusting home? So I'm going to say, methods and techniques come and go, but values should not shift. Like, we shouldn't just say, you know what, we just don't want trust in our relationship anymore, so we're just going to throw out that value. It's not relevant anymore. No, trust is always there, but how we accomplish a trustful relationship could look different because, we read a book or we go to a seminar and, we listen to a podcast and they're talking about trust and, oh, wow, that's a great idea. That's a great way to develop a more trusting relationship. Boundaries, healthy boundaries can develop a trusting relationship. And so, hey, let's work more on healthy boundaries and what that looks like, because the end goal is that we continue to develop a trustful, trusting relationship. And so remember, what you do can change and adjust, but who you want to be should be anchored pretty consistently, and maybe you add to that or further develop it, but not necessarily change that. That's why it's really important to spend a good amount of time on processing and thinking and developing this idea of who you want to be as a couple. And then what you do will become a lot easier, because when you make decisions, okay, does that either create a more trusting relationship, or would that diminish a trusting relationship? Would that really speak into our idea of missional living or stewardship, or would that not? So, hey, that's a great, thought and idea, but it doesn't work right now, or that really doesn't accomplish our goal and our vision for stewardship. So it doesn't mean it's wrong, it's just not best for us. And so that way it's a guide. When you do have those discussions and you are making decisions, you can tie it back into your vision and who you want to be as a couple. And again, you can include your family, you can include your kids in that. Just like when we've had actual discussions about missional living and that being a core value of ours, where our kids were in life, and, we couldn't go on a mission trip. And that's really a big background. And for Amy and I, is that both of us did a lot of mission trips in our lives overseas. And so that's an integral part of what we really want our kids also to discover and be able to do mission trips. And, one of our objectives is by the time our kids turn 18, they're able to go experience a mission trip somewhere. But we see that first and foremost important for our marriage in missional living. And when they were younger, you can't send a kid off to go do a mission trip. So there were other ways that we could accomplish missional living. We would read stories about friends that were doing missions overseas, where we would pray for them. Maybe we would create and put together a care package and then send that care package off. But we're talking about it and we're still engaging in this core value of missional living. It just looks different depending on the season of life we're in. So like Amy and I can't go off and just do maybe missions together because we're raising kids and we're in the throes of that. But when they graduate and they're off on their own, we can pivot to maybe more doing mission trips, and, whether those are short term or maybe a bit longer, I don't know. God will unfold that in His timing and based on that. So remember, how we accomplish our vision can grow, develop, change, but the core value of who we are isn't going to change. Like, we're probably not going to toss out missional living, because that's just a core value of how do we bless others around us locally, in our community, and then unto the uttermost parts of the earth. And how we participate in that just looks different at different times. And so that's what I want to present, sort of this concept of vision, why it's important. I hope you can see maybe from this high level discussion of vision and its importance and its value, why that would be anchoring, why that could hopefully be attractive to further dive into. If you go online, it's more about family mission or vision statements, which again, I'm not going to say is wrong. I'm not going to say you can't develop a family vision statement, because that is going to speak into what you and your spouse see as important and valuable. So what I really value about vision, and God really highlighting that, is we don't want to wait until we're in crisis to work on our marriage. And I think the value of a vision statement, it's more preventative maintenance of developing, creating, and sustaining a healthy relationship. Obviously, our marriage is going to go, and relationships are going to go through all sorts of seasons of life. We're going to track well with each other and be doing great, and then things are going to get hard or difficult. It's not if, but when, because that's just part, I think, of the marriage journey. But if we have that anchoring of things that help sustain us so we don't crater and fall apart, well, I think vision and a vision statement are one of those things that anchor you. So when you hit hardship, you can navigate that in a more healthy way and more with a vision that helps you navigate through maybe the hard and keeps you guys connected and united. And so, if that's a resource, we want you to participate in that 2-day event here at the Exo Center. And it's a very crafted, intentional guide. In fact, here's, the workbook that we've developed. So when couples come to participate, there'll be a guide that we're going to be very intentional to help you develop that vision for your relationship. And it might get to, again, what you can start doing. But remember, the goal is really to define who you want to be as a couple, go through the process of understanding how each of you see and understand different concepts and ideas so that you're united as much as possible in moving forward into then what you can do to accomplish that. And so that is what our events are there as a resource, as a guide, because we believe that that's a critical stage of, again, healthy relationships. Again, whether you're in crisis and struggling and you might need more coaching or a marriage intensive to help you get through those difficulties and challenges of the speed bumps you're hitting or the crisis you're in. The goal is, again, remember, it's a journey. It's not an event that you do this and then poof, everything's great. It's how do you consistently then engage in your vision as you're, whether that's, again, quarterly or once a year you go away or you come to Exo Center every year to do your vision retreat. And that's just a way to continue to grow in your relationship together. So we have the vision retreats, if that's of value and you want to learn more about that. Or you can look at some of our digital resources that assist with that. And remember, this is for, I think, all stages. I love the idea of when premarital couples engage in developing a vision, or at least starting that process. Again, I think that's super critical in the early stages of your marriage to really nail down a vision statement for who you want to be as a couple. And that way you don't let, that unintentional drift happen, and then it's harder to recover or get to developing a vision. But hear my heart, regardless of the season you're in, I think engaging in a vision statement and participating in that is for all seasons of marriage. It just is more the process of how you get there. So, if Exo Institute, Exo Marriage can be a resource for you in that, we're here because we know sometimes in my own life, it's been a lot of outside resources or things that have really helped me in that journey because I was just having a hard time trying to figure that out, for myself. Like, man, that's a great idea, but I don't even know where to start. That's just overwhelming to think about because my personality sort of needs to see something. Others can, you could create that from scratch because you're a visionary. You just can think about that. You can start to put that together. But remember, the way you're designed isn't necessarily the way your spouse is designed. So they may need more of a format or structure or guardrails that help them in that journey. So it could be a both and in that process. And so, if that's helpful, again, you can go to exoinstitute.com to learn more about our vision retreats. You can go to info@exomarriage.com to ask questions about that as well. So, thank you for participating in that. So thank you for this time, and we'll see you later.